Hi, I'm Sarah Mirk, and I'm a contributing editor at the Nib, and I'm the author of the book Guantanamo Voices, which is what we're going to talk about today.
And I'm Spencer Ackerman. I'm a national security reporter with the Daily Beast. And next summer, I'm going to be publishing a book about the war on terror's impact on American democracy called Reign of Terror, coming in August, hopefully, of 2021 from Viking. And I'm very excited to talk about
Sounds,
Sarah's exceptional book.
it sounds like an optimistic book, Reign of Terror.
Yes, it is just an uplifting story with really a clear, arc of moral redemption that just really shines through and animates the past 20 years of a background of constant war.
Well, the first thing I thought we should do is explain what Guantanamo Voices is.
Yeah,
But I'm the author and I've been promoting the book a lot, so I'm sick of explaining it. Do you want to try and summarize what it is from your perspective as a reader?
I would love to. Like no other book I've ever read, um, Guantanamo Voices is a narrative progression of different perspectives across the expanding time frame that the Guantanamo Bay detention facility both exists, persists, mutates, and is forgotten. And this is a story told in uh, an amazing journalistic style uh, of like making the best of what comic books can do as journalism, because in no other way could you really just visually express as vividly as uh, the lives of these people who are impacted and impact the broader understanding of Guantanamo Bay really are. People like former prosecutor Mo Davis, who quits in disgust over how the Guantanamo military commissions are a manufactured uh, aberration of justice that they've always been accused of being. So you have some stories of people who serve the Guantanamo complex, the Guantanamo mission, and uh, broader counterterrorism missions that come to see what a perversion and what a danger the persistence of them are. And of course, no story about the detention center uh, would be, complete or even responsible without centering the lived experience of detainees. And one of the things I really loved, Sarah, about the book is how you challenge the term detainees. And I'd like to ask you why you did that and what the stakes are behind that choice of word.
Yeah, that's a really great question because it's something I thought about a lot. So the Guantanamo Bay detention facility or detention camp is what the government calls it. I call it a prison. I just came to that conclusion after looking up the legal definition of prison. I was literally like, I think it's a prison. I should just double check and look that up in the dictionary. And it meets the dictionary definition of prison. But the government doesn't call it that. And that's one example of the way that the government has tried to control the narrative around Guantanamo. Controlling the narrative means telling us what the prison is for, telling us who's there, and then also determining what language we use to talk about it. And so as a reporter, I try to never take my cues and all of my sources from the government. So if I'm reporting on something that happened that involved the police, I don't just use the police's language to describe that encounter. I'll try and interview the people who were there or saw it or experienced it. Same way around Guantanamo. I think if you're ethically trying to report on Guantanamo, you can't just take the government's cues for what you should say. You can't just read from their press releases and say, okay, they say it's a detention camp, so it's a detention camp. When the word that like people understand it to be is prison. And detainees is the term for the people who are incarcerated at Guantanamo Bay. It's a term that, to me, if you're detained, that sounds brief. I've been detained by TSA. I've been detained by somebody stopping to ask me a question on the street. But if you're in prison for months, years, decades, that's not a temporary situation. That's a long time. And so that's why, to me, it felt important to like not just use the language that the government dictated that we use about this, but to say, okay, what's actually the situation here? This is a prison. It's full of prisoners. Let's describe reality as we see it. And the book, it tells, as you said, it tells 10 different stories from people who have spent time at the prison in some different capacity, and they're illustrated by 12 different artists. So it's a variety of styles throughout the book, and I really wanted the visual voice for each chapter to be different along with the voice of the person whose story we're telling. So you mentioned the narrative of Mo Davis, who was a colonel. And it was important for me to include perspectives like his because I wanted people to see like, oh, all these different people have spent time there in different ways. Here's how they have come to think of the prison, rather than just being from one voice.
I wanted to ask you about that choice because I found it really very powerful and just a brilliant, elegant way of distinguishing each of these voices, which of course is the promise of the title. Why did each individual artist take each individual story?
I wish there was some sort of like big philosophical answer to that, but honestly, it just came down to time. We made this book from beginning to end in a year. And the artists are all freelancers, actually from all around the world, who were like squeezing in this project amid the rest of their work. And so some of them had a lot of time to spend on it, and they could do a longer chapter, something that was like 25 or 30 pages. And some of them didn't have very much time, and so they needed a shorter chapter, something that was only like 10 pages. And so based on like how much time they could spend, determined what chapter they got. But then also, I really tried to think about what their artistic style looks like.
Mhm.
So Gerardo Alba, for example, who's the artist who illustrates the second chapter in the book, which is about Mark Fallon's perspective, and it's probably the most logistically complicated chapter. It's delving into like sort of the history of setting up the prison and the legal wrangling behind that. And there was just so much information there that I was like, okay, I need an artist whose style is really clean and who is really good at fitting a lot of information onto a page, but still making it feel spacious. And so I thought Gerardo would be really good at that. Whereas some of the other artists, like Omar Khoury, who illustrated the chapter about Mozambique, who was a prisoner, his style is so like emotionally intense and evocative that I wanted that to be for a chapter that like was really emotionally powerful, but had less of that like factual nitty gritty information in it. So his art style can really like convey a lot of feeling with just a few lines. It almost looks like a woodcut, and I wanted his to be a chapter that like had that emotional intensity to it, rather than having to explain a lot of like detailed information. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I wanted to ask also, do you have a different collaborative style with each, or did you write out like a page by page or panel by panel script and deliver them to each artist?
Yeah, I love working collaboratively. All of my work as a comics artist and writer are centered on collaboration. And so what I did for this book is, well, first I interviewed all these people who are featured in the book. Actually, first I read every book about Guantanamo. That's what I did for like a few months, was just read every book that was out there and use that to help determine who I wanted to interview. And then I contacted those people and interviewed them, and I took the transcripts of those interviews and edited those into being a massive script for the whole book. And yeah, I break down my writing for comics panel by panel and page by page. So it looks kind of just like a movie script where it's like page one, panel one, here's what you see. And it's all footnoted in there so that the publisher and a fact checker can go through it and make sure everything's correct. But then I give that script to the artist, and they can go through the process of doing first like storyboards, and then pencils, and then inks, and then colors. And I also shared the scripts for each chapter with the people that I interviewed so that they could give feedback and tell me, especially if anything was inaccurate or misrepresented about their story before we got to the drawing. That was really important to me because a lot of the people, not only had they trusted me to tell their stories, which is a huge honor and a huge weight, but a lot of them were dealing with a lot of trauma, whether they were imprisoned in Guantanamo or served there. That's a heavy trauma. And I just wanted to make sure that they didn't feel exploited in this process.
I think that's an important consideration. And did any of the artists visit Guantanamo? Because I've reported from there several times, and the visual accuracy of what we see is quite striking and clearly researched, except that for a lot of this stuff, reference material is not going to be easily available. So how did anyone actually go?
Yeah.
How did it?
Well, I got to go. So when I went to Guantanamo in the spring of 2019. And to go to Guantanamo, it's really tightly controlled. You have to apply to the military. They do a background check, and then they also determine whether they think you're with a legitimate media outlet. And so I needed a book deal in order to go. I needed to say, I have a publisher in New York. Here's my editor. I can go. Versus being an independent freelancer, they might not have let me go. But so I got to go, and I just took as many reference photos as I possibly could. And so I knew that this was going to be a comic, so I took reference photos of everything I could to get kind of the feel of life on base. So I took photos in the dining hall. I took photos at the McDonald's that's on base. I took photos of the high school stadium that's there, and the barracks and the living quarters. Everything I could take photos of that was creating that atmosphere of it being a real place full of real people. And then I gave those photos to the artists along with a massive Dropbox of photos that I got from the public domain and other outlets. So basically every photo I could find, I put into a big Dropbox. But none of the artists were actually able to go to Guantanamo. It's a pretty intensive process.
Yeah.
And I felt lucky that I got to go. And also it's weird that more people can't go. They should just let any member of the media go to Guantanamo if they want to, in my opinion. Have you been? I forget.
Yes, I've been 4 times. I've been 3 times to Guantanamo. In 2005, in 2009, or possibly 2010, and then 2014. Each time a little bit different in terms of how the different Pentagon media regimes operate, what they decide they're going to be particularly upset about or alternatively lax about enforcing. But then some things aside from the detention center itself really are eternal, and the surreality and from my perspective nauseating beauty of Guantanamo is part of the story. It's hard to explain sometimes, but I love the choices of color in this book, because this little section on the Antilles is just gorgeous in terms especially at sunrise and at sunset. You get this amazing peach colored skies on really fluffy clouds coming off of the water, and then you're in a gulag.
Yeah, and that's something that felt really surreal to me being there as well, is the natural beauty contrasted with the really terrible history and present. And to me, it felt like being really on dark ground. It felt to me like when I visited an internment camp here in California where people of Japanese descent were put during World War II. It felt to me kind of a similar energy being there, but then everyone around me was let's go watch the sunset and have a cocktail. And that felt, it felt awkward, that dissonance. And so I really wanted to capture that in the book. And the colors are, that color scheme, I called it a sunset tones color palette, both to bring out the natural colors of what it's like on the southern coast of Cuba, how gorgeous it is. And then specifically with the cover is inspired by a postcard that is sold in the Guantanamo Bay gift shop on the base. And To me, it just really looked like, this is the image of the prison that the government is selling. This is the image that they're selling: safe, humane, legal, beautiful sunsets. And then, but then when you look a little closer, it's really gruesome and violent. And so I wanted the cover to have that pretty upsetting contrast.
Now, you mentioned something in passing that we probably should dwell upon for a while because it speaks exactly to that theme, and that's Guantanamo Bay gift shop. Do you want to
Yeah,
tell people about this? Because, certainly when I talk about it to people who aren't, steeped in this, grotesque cavalcade that is the war on terror, they're rightfully like appalled and understand there's something really, obscene about it. So why don't you talk about what you mean by Guantanamo Bay gift shop?
yeah. So Guantanamo Bay Prison is on a naval base that's in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Um, and like any military base anywhere in the United States, there's like a little store where you can buy food, where you can buy clothes. And then they also have, I'm not sure if this is on every military base, but it's on every one I've been to. There's a little, it's called a naval exchange that sells like souvenirs from that specific base. And so the Guantanamo Bay Naval Exchange is like a little gift shop that sells souvenirs from Guantanamo Bay. And they have like mugs that say straight out of Gitmo. They have lots of like Disney paraphernalia. So like a Minions branded t-shirt that says Guantanamo Bay on it, which I couldn't make this stuff up. Also, when I was at Guantanamo Bay, the library on base was hosting an escape room for the community on base. And I took a photo of the sign and was like, this is like the most surreal thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the reality of the culture of Guantanamo Bay because they know what they're doing. They change with the times, the offerings they have at the necks, and when it's an Army and Air Force base, uh, it's a it's a PX, it's an AFIS facility. But yeah, like on every base you'll see this, but I remember in 2005 it was acceptable to like sell t-shirts and paraphernalia uh like commemorating and celebrating with an image of a snarling dog, the Joint Detentions Operations Group, or JDOG, which tortured detainees, which tortured people. um Later on they would switch it up and get cuter and more euphemistic, but sometimes it would be the Taliban Towers, and they would have the silhouette of the skyline of what is called Camp America.
Yeah, to me, it feels like basically a microcosm of regular American life. On the base, you've got a high school, you've got a library, you've got a grocery store, all these families living. And then right over the hill, where people don't really go, out of sight, out of mind, you actually can't go there if you're working on base and not affiliated with the prison, is the most infamous prison in the world, where people were tortured and where people are held indefinitely. And like, to me, that just really like feels a lot like the way that we deal with all prisons in the United States. Obviously, Guantanamo is different because it's a wildly extra legal situation, and there was massive torture that occurred there. But like all of the prisons in the United States, we build them to be out of sight, out of mind, and just think of them as like part of normal life. That having like the highest rates of mass incarceration is a normal thing that we all just like go along with, going to the grocery store, going to the library. So in that way, it's not really that different at all than being in any small town in the United States where there's a big prison nearby.
I think that's it's a vital point, that in that sense nothing is more American than Guantanamo Bay, that it just so happens that it's on like stolen Cuban land that the American government won't return.
Yeah, to me, it really feels like a circular situation. Like American prison complex influenced the creation of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, the prison, is like modeled actually on a supermax facility. Like they just use the same plans. And then also the way that we've like dehumanized and stigmatized people who are incarcerated is the same way that the government dehumanized and stigmatized people in Guantanamo Bay. And then it comes back around again because the policies we put into place at Guantanamo Bay impact the rest of our culture in such a huge way. Like all of the rules around Guantanamo constantly are in flux
Totally.
depending on like who happens to be in charge of the base at that moment. And so I got into a really weird situation when I visited where, I was on a media tour. The whole point of the tour was to go to the prison and be able to document what was happening there. And then on the last day of our trip, they told us, oh, actually, you can't publish any of the photos you've taken here. And it was like, what? Who made that rule? Why did it change? And no one has any answers. Like everyone's like, I don't know. Nobody knows. It's just the way that it is. So it really reminded me of like a surrealist play, like Waiting for Godot or something, where like messages are coming from on high and nobody knows what's happening or why.
So I always find this point fascinating. People might not know, but learned from Sarah's story just now that there is explicit media censorship at Guantanamo Bay. When you uh, go to Guantanamo Bay, a condition of it is signing a contract with the military that specifies submitting to military censorship. And what that is, all the times that I was there was through something called an OPSEC review, uh, meaning operational security, which is a pretext to go through frame by frame any photo that you're purporting to be able to publish and see if they show the face of a prisoner or any kind of intelligence gathering uh, equipment on the base, and they are not consistent or particularly consistent about any of this. And like had like a Facebook page with a photo dump from Guantanamo, in which like you could clearly see one of the cameras, and that had survived an OPSEC review. So yeah, it's a wild environment there, and unlike literally any base in Iraq or Afghanistan, I've done embeds on multiple occasions in both, and you are much freer to report in a war zone than you are at Guantanamo.
Yeah, and I think that really just speaks to like the government again really trying to control the narrative of what we understand about the prison, what we can say about it, and what Americans know about it. I mean, I think Americans almost like by and large really deeply misunderstand what the place is and who's there and what's happened there. And I don't really think that's their fault because the government has sold us lie after lie after lie on this and sold it very, very well and really been able to tightly control the message. And so if you're just a regular person, reading the paper or reading your Facebook feed, you're not going to get good, honest, transparent information about Guantanamo unless you really look for it. So you've been reporting on Guantanamo for, geez, how many years?
Well, I guess the first time I went there was 2005, so 15.
Wow. And how do you think will change the story to tell it in comics? I mean, part of the reason I wanted to tell it in comics is just to actually get people to read about it and see it as a real place full of real people.
Well, I found that to be a really powerful choice on I found that to be a really powerful choice. You really do bring it to life. And one of the like weird paradoxes of like going there and having reported on the place is that like it's easy for me to forget that like 99.9 to several decimals of the American people have no idea what this thing looks like. They have no idea except for a picture from 2002 of detainees shackled, behind their backs in an open air chicken wire camp called Camp X-Ray that closed after a few months. What Guantanamo has looked like as it has lasted for an entire generation. So just it really is a triumph of bearing witness just on that alone. You've created something that will allow people uniquely to know what this thing that was done in their name looked like and how the people inside endured it or didn't.
Yeah, that was a big part of my goal with the book was literally just to like make people see this place. I think that comics has a really unique power to make the invisible visible. So, and in part because of, there's so much censorship of what we can take photographs of at Guantanamo, we don't actually get to see the place. And I think comics are a good way around that censorship because, um, artists can use all the photos that we have, all the videos that we have, all the materials we do have, but then, use their artistry to fill in the gaps there and to be able to tell a story that has that like emotional truth that you just can't convey in a photo that's already been through government censorship.
Of all of the stories that the book tells, which is the one that's closest to you?
The story that really I think about the most in my own life is the story of Matt Diaz. He got deployed to Guantanamo right after the photos of the torture at Abu Ghraib leaked to the press and were published nationally. So he showed up at a really like intense time where he was kind of like, what are we doing? Wow, this is upsetting. And when he got there, his job was sort of like putting together and collating all the information of reports from prisoners about their treatment to put into government reports that would never see the light of day. And at that same time, the Bush administration was not releasing the names of the people who were in Guantanamo. So at this time in the history, we didn't even know who was in the prison. And like the families of the men who were in prison there didn't know what had happened to their sons, to their fathers. They were like, maybe this guy's in Guantanamo. We don't know because the Bush administration won't release the names. And so a group called the Center for Constitutional Rights, as well as a coalition of other legal people, were suing the Bush administration to make them release the names and tell them who was in this prison. And Matt Diaz had access to the database that said the list of all the names of the people in the prison. And it was found unconstitutional to keep those names secret, to not release them to the public. But the Bush administration still fought it every step of the way and refused to make them public. And so Matt Diaz is in this really tricky situation where he's like, I'm at this prison where we are not telling the public who's incarcerated here. That's unconstitutional, but then my bosses are telling me definitely don't release these names. So what am I supposed to do? And I think that's the situation that like all of us would find ourselves in this morally complicated situation. Like, what would you do? All of us want to believe like, oh, we'd stand up for justice and like do the right thing. But like, maybe not, probably not. Most people who are stationed there don't engage in acts of civil disobedience. There's been thousands and thousands of people who have worked at Guantanamo Bay. And this is literally the only act of civil disobedience I've ever heard of. There have been other people who, after they came back from their service there, after they got out of the military, started speaking out about it. But when you're actually in the mix, if you speak up, you get thoroughly punished. And so in this case, Matt Diaz was in this tricky situation, trying to decide whether he should release these names or keep them, follow his boss's orders. And he decided to print off the list of names and stick it in an envelope that he mailed to the Center for Constitutional Rights. Like, I'm going to leak these names because it's supposedly unconstitutional to keep them private, but I don't want to fight my bosses about it. And very quickly, the military found out about that, and he was sent to the brig. So he was imprisoned for 6 months. He was kicked out of the military. He was discharged, and he was disbarred. And so for a long time, he couldn't find work, and he had to use like his daughter's college fund to pay for her living expenses while he was imprisoned. And to me, that's just like such a moral question of like what do you do in that situation? And in some ways, we're all in that situation. Like, what do we do about this prison and this torture that's been done in our names as Americans? How far are we willing to go? How much are we willing to personally risk to do what we think is right?
And when you put it like that, it really underscores the moral emergency of how normalized this thing is. I tend to think that, Guantanamo, like the broader war on terror, gives us a really direct lesson ahead of what we've, seen with Trump, and how we get to what we've seen with Trump in how atrocity gets normalized. What do you think it says about us that this place still exists in 2020, and that throughout, the past 4 years, nothing has changed with it and no one has really made it an issue?
Yeah, it's really upsetting. Something a stat that I found that I included in the book is that Americans, as of today, are more in favor of torture than they were 10 years ago. So we've as a culture, we've
Mhm.
become more okay with torturing people. What's going on there? I don't have a great philosophical answer for that because I don't understand it. I don't know what's happened and how to fix all of our kind of like broken ethos around that. But I do know that as we've seen over and over in US history, when we dehumanize someone else or a group of people, we don't think of them as being humans like us who have lives like us and should have rights like us. And so, in a lot of ways, Guantanamo is not a departure from American history. In American history, the people who, the white people who founded the country dehumanized the indigenous people who were here, dehumanized Black people who were enslaved, dehumanized uh, people who we colonized in other countries. In all of those cases, we dehumanized them and said, we're not the same as them. We don't need to, we don't have to follow the same laws in dealing with them as in dealing with ourselves. And I see that so clearly here at Guantanamo, where we've created an entire separate legal system to deal with a prison that's 779 Muslim men and one non-Muslim man.
Mhm.
And to say we're following a different legal process around these people because they're not as human as we are. When the prison was first created, the Bush administration said it would be for only the worst of the worst, like high level terrorists. And there was this really famous quote that really stuck in everyone's minds um, from somebody in the Bush administration who said that like these men would chew through the lines on
C7
airplanes, yeah,
through
to
through the hydraulic lines. I think it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Air Force General Richard Myers.
Yeah, he said that these guys who were going to Guantanamo would chew through the lines on an airplane to bring it down. That's how much they hated America. And so when you have that mentality of like, oh, these aren't people, they're animals, they're wild beasts who would kill us given any chance, then you can do whatever you want to them. Um, and so I really see it as like, it's not really that different than what we've done to other people throughout American history. Um, it's just that it's happening within my lifetime, and that's upsetting to me.
I can tell from that how much this must have taken out of you in researching, in writing it, and particularly in doing it during COVID.
Yeah, it was bad. I say in the acknowledgments that like I really should have gone to therapy while writing this book.
We benefited, and history will benefit so much from the fact that you've borne witness in such an important way, in a way that truly demonstrates what you are about. um, and people forever will now know what Guantanamo Bay looked like and how it felt to many important people who it forever impacted. Uh,
Hmm.
and I salute that achievement, and thank you for it.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, do you feel like in your own reporting, do you have to like take a break from writing about this kind of stuff because it's too heavy, or do you feel like an obligation to keep writing about it?
Um, so all I've ever done is this, um, and writing a book about it uh, like forced me to deal with a lot of things that I didn't realize I had to deal with. And some of that is personal stuff that comes out when like you review like everything you've ever written and like turn it into kind of like one thing. and so you like see like where your mistakes are, and that's very humbling. But also like, this is just an exceptionally painful and raw topic in a lot of ways, and a lot of times uh, when you document it, like particularly when you're documenting people in absolute crisis like this, which wars are, which prisons are, which intelligence activities in a lot of cases are, you don't want to like acknowledge that you are also experiencing it. And when you do something to kind of sum it up, all of that gets brought back. So it's like it's a hard thing to do sometimes. And I like I I broke down like several times in writing that book, and you know
Yeah. I feel like I just went from one crisis to another. Like I finished writing this book literally the week that the lockdown started with COVID. And
oof.
so it was like I was expecting to feel some kind of relief, like, all right, I did it. And then instead it was just like the same level of stress continued apace.
Hmm.
But I do feel like, honestly, people say this, it's such a dark topic. And I know it's like never a good time to talk about Guantanamo. It's not like a happy topic. But honestly, I feel better like writing about it and facing this truth than just ignoring it. I feel like for the last, 15 years and more since the prison opened, I feel like I've just been wandering around being like, am I insane or is this very bad? To me, it just kind of felt like, oh, finally, like I feel good about facing this history rather than just ignoring it.
Yeah, I can very much relate to that.
Yeah.
You deserve a lot of credit for writing it. I was also very impressed to see an introduction by Omar al-Akkad, whose novel American War, I think, is just the single greatest piece of fiction to come out of the War on Terror.
I felt really lucky to be able to get him to write the introduction. We sat down and talked about reporting on Guantanamo right when I started writing the book. And he lives in Portland, and so do I. And since there's not that many people that care about Guantanamo, it's like a small world. So we met up for coffee, and honestly, I just listened to him talk, and like everything he said, I was like, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I want the book to do. And so I was extremely glad that he could write the introduction for it. And something that he really says there is that, the antidote to like to having this history be erased is to really um, to look at it and to face it when it's tough stuff. So he says, hopefully this book can be an antidote to forgetting, which is important because I feel like most Americans have already forgotten about Guantanamo.
I agree, and thank you for not letting us forget.